Acting Speaker. What were you wearing? How many drinks did you have? What did you eat before you went out? Why were you out so late last night? These are the questions women right around Queensland are being asked when they come forward pleading for help. They have been raped, they have been stripped of their dignity, they have been left bare, begging for someone to believe them. And instead of stepping up, the government has allowed a culture that has vehemently questioned a victim's legitimacy. It is what victim survivors tell me when I speak to them. It is what they told the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force. It's what they are crying out for in the streets that we witnessed over the weekend. One submitted to the task force wrote, "I did not report this to police or tell another person because at the time it was assumed that I had put myself in a position where I was responsible for the outcome." Another said, "I felt embarrassed that I let it happen to me. I didn't want to go through police and court and feel as though I'd be judged, even though I know I did nothing wrong." And another wrote, "I was young when I was sexually assaulted. I knew I could report it. I knew I could tell someone, but I didn't think anyone would believe me." To all the victim survivors who have felt this way, we must do better. We must believe them. We must emphasise that sexual assault is not a result of a woman's bad behaviour or what she wears. It is a result of a victim's poor choice. The only one responsible is the perpetrator. In Queensland, 24% of women have experienced sexual violence since the age of 15. That's essentially 1 in 4. There are women of this House where we have experienced sexual violence. That's 1 in every family. It's at least 1 in every friendship group. We are at a point of greater anger amongst the community at the violence being perpetrated against women. And I was at the rally in Brisbane on the weekend, and it was palpable. It is not a woman's problem. It is the perpetrator's problem. It is a man's problem. And what people don't want more is more talk. Talk doesn't make people safer. The LNP has shown our support for the Victims Commissioner, and we want to see the rollout of all of the recommendations of the Hear Her Voice and a call for change. We want to make sure all those voices that contributed are heard. However, women should not have to wait so long. The updates of the progress of these recommendations was laid bare at the end of last year, and it was clear that the government has fallen behind. So far, they have changed the scope of dozens of recommendations in the hope that if changing the timeframes, that maybe no one will notice that they are behind. But the people who notice are those victims. They are the people who are watching things stay the same, feeling the same level of fear, if not more fear than the past, concerned for their safety every day, and nothing ever changes, and in some cases it has gotten worse. Whether it is the effective rollout of the Respect for Relationships education program or a statewide victim advocate service or ensuring victims can access rape kits no matter where they are or when they turn up, victims still wait. It is our hope the establishment of the Victims Commissioner and the Sexual Violence Review Board will highlight issues in our system as quickly as possible in an open, honest and transparent way. The Victims Commissioner and Sexual Violence Review Board Bill establishes the Sexual Violence Review Board, which I will turn to shortly, and the Victims Commissioner, which the Shadow Minister for Youth Justice and Victim Support will speak to later in the debate. The Sexual Violence Review Board is intended to identify and review systemic issues in relation to the reporting, investigation, prosecution of sexual offences. The board will review government policy, practices, procedures and systems to identify systemic issues, review and analyse data and information held by government entities and non-government entities, make recommendations to the Minister, government entities and non-government entities about improvement to government policy, practices, procedures and systems as a result of a review carried out by the board, and monitor the implementation of recommendations. And it is my wish that as a member of the opposition that information is shared quickly, transparently, in a bipartisan way to ensure victims are heard first and responded to quickly. This will follow through on recommendation 46 of the Hear Her Voice report too, and I understand it is intended to have a broad scope to allow it to review any part of the criminal justice system in relation to sexual offence, ranging from a victim survivor's initial reporting of an offence to an entity such as a health service, support service, or the police to the conduct of a court proceeding. However, the explanatory notes make clear that the board is not intended to conduct case reviews of individual sexual offence matters or make recommendations regarding disciplinary action for the conduct of individuals in an investigation and prosecution of specific cases. Recommendation 46 specifically stated, the board's function and powers will be provided in legislation and should include the independent review of sexual cases that are not progressed or cases requested to be considered by the Victims Commissioner. This bill overlooks that core element of recommendation 46 to conduct independent reviews of sexual violence cases. This is a clear restriction on the recommendation put forward by Justice McMurdo and the task force, of which we greatly respected her contribution. It highlights the value in reviewing sexual violence cases that are not progressed or cases to be requested by the Victims Commissioner. And the Domestic Violence Prevention Centre of the Gold Coast supported this recommendation. The scope of the matters, and they said, the scope of the matters that the board can review is not broad enough to cover all of the systemic barriers that victims of sexual assault face in the criminal system. The board will not be able to provide meaningful advice on systems reform if it does not include in its review matters where the prosecution has been successful. However, there were systemic issues apparent, including during sentencing, during the offender's time in custody or parole proceedings. The scope of the board should include review of cases where sentencing has been inadequate, review of cases that Victims Commissioner may refer to the board, which may have had a finding of guilt, but where there were issues in the reporting, the investigation, the prosecution, or the sentencing of sexual offences. Certainly on the opposition, we support that position. The Queensland Sexual Assault Network agreed, stating the Sexual Violence Review Board should comply with the Task Force complete recommendation and undertake both individual and systemic review. QSAN strongly supports this approach. And the Gold Coast Centre Against Sexual Violence made the comments, we are concerned that the model proposed in this bill is not entirely consistent with the Task Force recommendations and must be amended in order to maximise community confidence and the safety and the well-being of victim survivors of sexual and domestic violence. We believe if this bill is amended to accurately reflect the Task Force recommendations in their entirety, it will enhance safe, ethical, trauma-informed support to victim survivors of sexual, domestic and family violence and improve community and system responses. Ending violence against women and children, Queensland echoed these sentiments, stating, we support that the Task Force recommendations be implemented in full to ensure both individual and systemic accountability for victims of sexual violence. Legal Aid Queensland. We support the implementation of the Victims Commissioner and Sexual Violence Review Board to review cases that are not progressed or failed to be successfully prosecuted. No more stated than that by their clients, often feeling marginalised or excluded from criminal proceedings, and encourage the bill be expanded to include independent reviews. DV Connect goes on to say, while the bill suggests that individual issues may be considered indicators of larger systemic issues, this leaves behind a broad gap in response and accountability. First, individuals who have experienced this high personal, highly traumatic and severely poorly responded to crime deserve to have a body that oversees all matters. Further, this capability will increase the opportunity to identify systemic issues that could have been easily dismissed without this closer inspection. There are many examples of how individual cases, if more closely examined, may have highlighted the significant systemic issues that have been raised across the task force reports. Call for change and the forensic DNA inquiry well before such task force and inquiries were needed. And we saw this come from one of the biggest systemic failings our justice system has ever seen with the DNA lab. We know over 41,000 cases will need to be reviewed by the legal-led review team, with only 440 case samples tested so far and 193 returning profiles where they haven't previously had the potential before, the potential before cannot be understated. It genuinely could mean thousands of offenders of assault, of rape and of murder are walking free amongst Queenslanders and have been for some time. This is the most abhorrent case of government maladministration in living memory. The monumental failure of the state-run Forensic Services Lab, overseen by the Palaszczuk Miles government, where it was found that the DNA lab was failing in its most fundamental task, to find DNA. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was uncovered from one single case. One single case, more closely examined, uncovered a systemic failing. I will turn now to the membership of the board. It is intended to be chaired by the Victims Commissioner and consists of 8 other members. 4 government members, that being the Police Commissioner or their nominee, the Director of Public Prosecutions or their nominee, a public sector employee who is appropriately qualified in forensic services or clinical forensic medicine, and a public sector employee who is appropriately qualified in matters relating to the court system, and up to 4 non-government members who have skills, knowledge and experience in sexual offence matters, providing support services to victims of sexual assault and or a victim of sexual violence. As per the explanatory notes, the board must include at least 1 person who has lived experience as a victim of sexual violence and at least 1 member who is an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. And this is critical to ensure that there is informed and supportive outcomes. The public advocate noted in their submission that they would like to see a member of the community with lived experience or disability be included in the board, and Legal Aid Queensland believe there should be a member of the board with legal experience on the board, specifically from a criminal defence perspective. The Domestic Violence Prevention Centre from the Gold Coast also noted that anyone with a domestic violence or sexual offence, whether summary or indictable against them, be disqualified from appointment as Commissioner of the board. It is my sincere hope that the Sexual Violence Review Board is a step in the right direction towards uncovering and resolving the systemic issues plaguing victims of sexual violence and preventing them from receiving justice. That the recommendations provide a validation for victims, a recognition of how system failures have translated to failing victims, and an opportunity for government to respond, resource and improve outcomes for victims. Victims of crime and survivors of sexual violence have been made vulnerable by the Palaszczuk Miles government over the course of the last 9 years in failings that I've outlined, in particular around the DNA forensic lab. The lack of leadership and the lack of action by this government has left our community vulnerable and, for many victims, unsafe. So while those opposite may preach around community safety efforts and new plans that have been released, Queenslanders understand and know better because they are living the experience of the failings each and every day. The hundreds of people who marched on Parliament with voices for victims over the course of this day know better. The families and friends of victims who have been murdered in Queensland since those opposite have come to power know better. And most concerning, I think for all Queenslanders, is that perpetrators have worked it out and they know better. It was the state Labor government that watered down the Youth Justice Act. It was the state Labor government who have dragged their feet in failing to roll out the recommendations of the Hear Her Voice report in a timely manner. And it is this current state Labor government who have allowed murderers and rapists to potentially be walking free as a result of the forensic lab failure, with no near hope in sight of justice for many of those victims. It was this government's failing in providing a substandard rape kit, the lack of trained and available staff to carry out procedures associated with collecting in critical evidence. And it was only through brave victims like the young woman in Central Queensland who came forward after she was sent away to photograph her own injuries and collect her own evidence. In fact, the number of victims of rape and sexual offences has grown without fail year on year. Last year, it was up 105% since the state Palaszczuk Labor government came to power, and already in the first 2 months of this year, there have been 1,648 victims of rape and sexual offences. And tragically, of those, 674 were children, that is almost half, a growing cohort. This is an absolute disgrace, and those leading the government should hang their heads. This is just another reason why the Sexual Violence Review Board should be given the full powers recommended by the task force and Justice McMurdo almost 2 years ago. The Hear Her Voice report isn't the only review that we have seen unacceptable delays with. We have seen report after report and recommendation after recommendation put on the shelf by those opposite because it's not publicly palatable to be upfront with Queenslanders. Enough is enough. The systemic issues that have allowed to fester under this state Labor government must stop. It is our hope that the Sexual Violence Review Board will contribute to this greatly. While we know those opposite are not known for transparency, Madam Acting Speaker, I wanted to raise the issue that we have seen in too many bills before coming before this House, and it is the time given for consultation. Transparency aside, which is clearly where it is under this government, the impact on frontline services, community organisations, those that are pressed hard enough to deliver services to long wait lists of victims of sexual violence and domestic violence are pulled away from their core business at the will and the whim of this state government without any extra resourcing to undertake lengthy engagement that should be meaningful and should be co-designed. But instead, they are giving short timeframes to be able to contribute greatly their insights into this legislation. The frontline workers in this service have a passion to change the ongoing scourge of domestic and family violence. We are on the eve of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and I would like to pay tribute to the fantastic domestic violence support services across our community and our state. They are compassionate, they are generous, they are exhausted, they provide refuge for those at their lowest moment, they help them to rebuild their lives, they give them strength that when they are required to do so. They're passionate to make change for the long term. They also, Madam Deputy Speaker, many are not funded by the government and don't receive any support or funding. While we welcome on the opposition any announcement to increase funding, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are a number of organisations doing incredible things across our state that also deserve recognition and funding to be able to work collaboratively in the interest of victims. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to address some of the statements made by the government when it comes to politicking. Since I've held this portfolio as the Shadow Minister for the Prevention of Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence, the opposition has taken the position of a bipartisan approach. We have endorsed every recommendation and supported the government's approach in a bipartisan way to the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force. And I, like many members on this side of the House, engaged with Justice McMurdo as part of that work. But to hear members of the government, and in particular female members of the government, that want to play politics with what is a very important issue, what women across our state expect is government and opposition to work together, not to see disgraceful media releases scaremongering women and victims of violence across this state. I have given an undertaking to every women's service that is funded by the government that we will work with them, we will ensure that the resourcing they need, they receive, and that it goes to help those victims that endlessly